And for this one, I think that everybody is familiar with Yelp, which is provide information about a point of interest. So this is the Yelp API, and we're trying to build a custom connector around the Yelp API. So the Yelp API does provide a lot of interesting endpoints here, which is search for businesses, phones, or whatever. What we're trying to do this time, we're trying to search for businesses in this example. And before you start building the custom connector around an API, you need to understand how does the API works. And you need to read the documentation, because a lot of that depends on a lot of those bits and pieces in the documentation, the custom connector will be dependent on. So if we go to Power Automate, and then we go to build a custom connector, and notice that you'll have multiple, notice that I've done that before multiple times, but we'll do it once again. But notice that you have multiple possibilities. And then exactly the same Azure function that I showed you earlier, you could have it as a custom connector. So you could be able to do that, or whether you have an open API file for the for your API, you could do that from there. You could do that from a URL. You could do that from an import a Postman collection. But we're going to do today, we're going to start all over from blank. All right, so we're going to call this ESPC underscore webinar, and then continue. At this point, what we want to do is we need to set some general information for the custom connector. And I lost focus. All right. Okay. So now, so what we want to do is we want to set the icon background. So for example, that we could put some kind of like an image in here. So I do have an image in here, so I'll copy it from there and upload the connector, sorry, upload connector icon, and it should upload this one. And if you want to change the color for this one, you could do that, make it black or make it white. It doesn't matter. All right. So for this time, we will make it white. And then if you want to add some description for that custom connector, you could just do that for here. If you're connecting to an on-prem API, you could do that from here. You check that, and then you have to go through providing the data gateway that you have defined. Let's say that you do have some APIs that is running on-prem for your company. You could do that from here. So the scheme here, after that, you choose the scheme, whether this is HTTPS or HTTP. So for luckily, the one that we are consuming here is HTTP. And then the next thing that we need to get the host. And the way that I knew what the host for this API is by going back to the documentation. And as you can see here, it just says that all Fusion API endpoints are running under this. So this is the only thing that I need to care about. All right, so I'll get back again in here. So we move to security. And for security, again, we need to go back to documentation. And as you can see here, that in the documentation, it says that authenticate API calls with the API key. So apparently that you need an API key. And in order to get an API key, you need to create an account or a developer account with Yelp, and then you'll be able to consume their services. Luckily, I've done that before, but here it says to authenticate API calls with the API key, set the authorization HTTP header as bearer key, and then the key. So what we need to do is we are sending that in the header, so we know that we are sending that in the header. So we go back again and do exactly what it says. So this is going to be an API key, and the parameter label at this point, it does not matter. I could call it SPC key, for example. It doesn't matter. But what matters is actually the parameter name. And the parameter name is authorization, exactly how it mentioned in the documentation back here. Sorry. So it says authorization HTTP in the header, the value of the bearer, and then you pass in the API key. So I'll go back again, and this is in the header. It seems to be fine for me here, so I move on to the next one. So what we want to do here is we want to define the actions and triggers that we want to do with this connector. So a connector, it could consists of several actions, or let's say several triggers. So that depends on how you define this API. So for example, if those APIs does have some kind of like, webhooks, when something happens, it will just send back some payload or return something that you could define some triggers. You could do that. But this time around, so what we're doing, we're going to be only defining an action. So this action is going to be called business search. And for the description, it's going to be exactly the same. And the operation ID is going to be also a business search. All right. So this is for the first part. It's just a general part. You define, for example, a summary, some description about your API they're going to be consuming, and the operation ID. The next thing that we want to do, we want to do a request. And then in this request, we have to go back to the documentation. So we go to the documentation because we're going to be doing some business search. So what it does here, the request is going to be a GET, and it's going to be consuming this URL. But there's also some parameters that could be sent along with the request. And as you can see here, so these parameters should be in the query string. But not all of them are required, but some of them are basically required, because if you're searching for businesses, at least you need to say, I'm searching for burgers, I'm searching for coffee. So this is the least thing that you need to pass in within, and you need to pass in a location. So where are you actually searching for example, let's say you're searching for coffee in New York, you're searching for coffee in Oslo, and so on and so forth. So you need to provide those parameters for the custom when you're doing the call for the API. So if I go back again in here, and from the documentation, this is a GET, and I do understand that there's going to be a URL. So I do have the URL in here. So I'll just copy it from the clipboard and then paste it in here. Okay. And I'll just explain the rest of the this afterwards, but I'll just import in here. And notice that I did pass something within the query string. I did pass the term, I did pass the location, the latitude and longitude. So the term is actually what I'm searching for. The location is where you're actually looking for that point of interest, in which city, for example, in which country. And the last thing, the radius of the search. So this is, you're going to be given a longitude and a latitude. So the longitude and latitude are not actually that important. What we want to do is we want to set these the term as required, because we want to send this for the service. And the second thing that we want to do, we want to set the location as required. And notice here that this is extra information that you could provide for the parameter, and that's something that you need to look into if you're doing that for your company, because that will give metadata for those who are actually trying to consume that connector, consuming that connector. Yeah. So we made the term and location as required. So we don't need the longitude and latitude to be required for now. Now we get to the response on what is the expected response to get back from the service. So what we want to do in here is we want to add a default response, or we could get that from the response in here. So this is the default response, edit, or not. This is not what I'm looking for. I think I add a default response. Okay, so I'll paste it in here. And this is as well as coming from the documentation. So if I go back in here, notice that this is the response body, and this is what expected to come back from that service. And this is what is gonna be forming our dynamic data or dynamic content that we call in Microsoft in Power Automate. So in Power Automate, when you consume a connector, and then there will be some properties or content returned with each and every connector, this is what's going to be returned in here, and this is going to form our dynamic content. So if I go back again in here, and I do have the format in here, so I'll just copy that in here and just paste it here in the body and import. This is going to take a while, I think. There we go. So you see that's the default, and then within the body, there's like a several dynamic content that is actually returned within the response. And this is basically what I've actually have passed in as JSON. So we don't need to do anything at this point right now. The only thing that we need to do is just press create the connector. And hopefully this will go through quickly. All right, so this has been successfully verified, so we could go and test it right now. So what we need to do right now is create a connection against the connector, the custom connector, and now it's going to ask me for that key, which is basically the key. And as you notice in there, you'll see that it's the label. It says ESPC key. And then I put in here the key, which is the one that I use for my developer account, and then I create a connection, and hopefully this will work. Just do some refresh. There you go. And then we have a term. Let's say that we want it's about, I don't know, everybody's from different places. I don't know if it's lunchtime, dinner time. So I'm just gonna search for burgers, and the location is gonna be Oslo, and then try to test the operation. And notice here, it returned some businesses. So there we have illegal burger, Oslo at some point, and then we have different businesses. So once you've created that, so we have created the connector. So now the connector is going to be available for us in the list of connectors. So let's say that if we went and tried to build, a flow. So the flow is going to be, let's say here, term. And then the second one is going to be, let's say that the location is going to be taken from the button. So I'll just delete that. So the next step is going to be ESPC. There you go, ESPC webinar. And then we have business search. And inside of here, we need to pass in the term. The term is going to be taken from the button, and the location is going to be the city from the button. And we don't need to pass in the longitude and latitude. And then what I'm going to do here is compose. And inside the compose, I could just put, for example, businesses, I think. I do have businesses. There you go. So inside of this is going to be a collection of businesses. I could go through them. You could do whatever with them. So I'll just save that and test that. I'll perform the trigger. Continue. Hopefully we'll get that. Okay, allow. And then I will just say again, burgers. Run flow.